Hello and welcome to the DocArena Podcast in association with Film Ireland. My name is Whitaker, and every fortnight or so I want to dig deeply into the motivations of documentary filmmakers. How do they choose their subject material? And what approaches and strategies do they employ to fund, craft and distribute their work? In this episode, I'm delighted to speak to Felicity Morris and Bernie Higgins, the director and producer of The Tinder Swindler, a feature doc now streaming worldwide on Netflix. The film tells the story of three women who are swindled by a man posing as a rich playboy on dating app Tinder and their attempts to bring him to justice. This romance turned mystery turned thriller is another blockbuster doc from Raw Television, the company behind docs like The Imposter, American Animals, Don't Fuck With Cats and Fear City, some of which Bernie and Felicity have produced. I really enjoyed this conversation with Felicity and Bernie, and I think it's a great illustration of the teamwork behind a film like this and the process of taking an idea from inception to launch on Netflix. Here's the interview. I'm delighted to be joined by director Felicity Morris and producer Bernie Higgins to discuss The Tinder Swindler. To start off with, Felicity, could you give us a little bit more background on the story?
The story, in a nutshell, without giving too much away, is about how one little swipe on Tinder turns a group of women's lives totally catastrophically upside down when essentially they swipe and meet and some of them fall in love with the person they think is their total Prince Charming in every single way, ticks every single box. And as you might gather from the title, he turns out to be sort of nothing as to what they think that he is, and is an international con artist who takes them for everything and turns their dreams and their lives upside down. And but the great thing about this story is that the women seek revenge, so they attempt to bring him down.
And Bernie, how did you end up coming to this story? What was the background in terms of you ending up producing it?
Well, actually, it was Felicity came to me and asked me to produce it when she decided she was going to direct it. We've been working together for a few years at the same company, but never on the same film. And it was something that we really wanted to do. And this just spoke to us. We felt very strongly that we could tell this story, that we understand this world, that we know women like this, that we're friends with women like this, that we have experience of online dating and everything else. And we just felt that there was nobody better placed to tell the story than us as a partnership. So it was a very easy decision to say yes.
At what stage was the project at that point? Was it already in train or were you guys instigating it?
Well, the story had already been published. Well, the films, as you know, is in 3 acts, and the first 2 acts of the story had already been spoken about publicly by a Norwegian publication called VG. So Cecilia had gone to them when she felt that the police weren't that interested in her story, and they, like us, thought this is incredible and people have to know about this. So they shared the story. And then it was as a result of that our production company, Raw, took it on. So at that, it had already been published in the media, but not through film and not to the extent that we tell the story in the film, and not with all of the contributors that came to light as a result of our research for the film. Mm-hmm. So we really got into it right at the beginning in terms of the filmmaking of it.
Yeah. And Felicity, at what point did you discover this story and think, oh my God, I have to follow this?
Well, as Bernie said, we read, I think it was the Daily Mail had picked it up in the UK, the story of this Tinder con artist. And Cecilia and Pernilla had both spoken out at that point. And so we, with another production company in LA, we got in contact with them. It's a co-production between Raw and AGC in LA. And invited Cecilia and Pernilla into the office to have a meeting. And I was working in development at the time at Raw, so sort of managing a sort of slate of documentaries, feature documentaries at Raw, and sat with both of them. And they were I was sort of blown away by how, amazing storytellers they are. When you're thinking about making a film, you obviously want your central protagonist to be people that can keep you, tuned in for however long your film or series will be. They were both, angry. They really were desperate to sort of expose Simon on another level. They were rightly mad and angry, and wanted justice for themselves. So that for me was a really big pull to the story, was because at that point Simon was still on the run. He hadn't been arrested at that point. So I thought, well, this is actually a sort of a live story that's still ongoing, and that on a platform like Netflix would be a sort of a real amazing opportunity to tell their story to the world and expose him, further than the newspaper article that we had already read was doing at the time.
You're working in development at Raw at the time, so obviously you had a bit of a pull on what kind of ideas were coming into the company, but it seems to jump off the page. Was there any difficulty convincing your colleagues that this was something you should pursue further?
No. I think that when you take into account sort of where this story goes, the idea that it's a real global story. Simon, is Israeli. The women are from all over Europe. You can kind of, travel around with it. We realized, we sort of discovered that actually it sort of starts off as a love story, really, as a kind of almost like the greatest rom-com ever. Girl meets boy of her dreams and gets whisked off on a private jet. Then it turns into a mystery. Then it sort of turns into a horror. Then there's a thriller element to it. And then there's this sort of cat and mouse chase of what's going to happen to him. How is he going to have his comeuppance? So I think, all of those elements were there and more as we sort of got into it.
It does feel like a natural fit for Netflix. And I know that international element immediately makes you think, okay, a worldwide platform, maybe they once be interested in this. But what kind of conversations would you have had at that point in terms of thinking about what you might do with this, or I suppose how you would do the development to make sure that you gave it its best chance of finding a home and ending up where it ended up?
Yeah, I think, like you say, for Netflix, it was, just a really good tale for them. I think a really good story. I mean, it's an amazing story for any network, but I think, Netflix in particular, has that sort of big global reach. None of the contributors are American. A lot of stories that we've made in the past have involved, American stories. We'd just we'd just come off the back of making Don't Fuck with Cats for Netflix, which sort of had a similar, in the Tinder Swindler, we have this incredible digital archive that we get access to, which is the WhatsApp messages. And I think that we knew early on that we'd want to use them as part of the storytelling. And off the back of making Don't Fuck with Cats, which obviously had that sort of big Facebook digital archive, we knew how to do that. And Netflix, had said, we'd love another contemporary story. We'd love another story that sort of dips into the online world. And so for them, it just, I think they commissioned it quickly, and then allowed for me to direct it. It's my first time directing, and I knew that I needed a partner. And Bernie and I have both been producers for a long time, and both complement each other in terms of filmmaking. And it was very much a sort of dual filmmaker effort, making a film together.
See, I mean, you had this amazing digital archive. You knew you had, at least 2 or 3 excellent interviewees. I mean, presumably then as a team, you kind of went, well, there's a lot here, but we don't necessarily want to interview every single person that's been swindled. We don't necessarily want to interview everyone they know. So, I mean, Bernie, from a production point of view, how did you start approaching that and trying to construct that, make sense of it, and work together to get to where you got to?
Well, it was always very important to us that the film not be a platform for Simon. It was very much a platform for the women to be heard, as they felt they hadn't been heard where they'd gone to previous people for help. So we really wanted it very much to be their story. So if it wasn't part of their story, it wasn't in the film, basically. So it was combined by hours and hours and hours of research interviews with all of the contributors to fully understand their entire story, not just as it happened within that time frame, but who were they when they came to Tinder that day, what had happened to them previously, what were their motivations, what were they looking for, and really getting underneath their skin and understanding who they were as characters, because we always knew that it was them that we needed to understand, and it was them that we wanted to represent. So yeah, in terms of how to tell the story, I mean, what we always do in the first instance is kind of figure it out in a linear fashion, what chronologically, kind of the timeline, who met and when, what happened. And then once we have all of that information, that's when we can kind of start playing with it in terms of the writing of it and the editing of it. When do we bring in this character? Is it important that we know all of their backstory, or can they come in at this point? So we always knew that we were going to be starting with Cecilia, and that it was going to be kind of, she would be the lift off of the story, and then the other women would come into it as they came into her life. That was always kind of, that always just made the most sense to us and how to do it. So in terms of, the riches of Simon that we were finding out, obviously the key thing is to find out everything that we can and then make a decision of whether or not to include it. So we found out lots about Simon during the making of the film that we didn't include in it. And that was a very deliberate choice, because otherwise we'd be going off in tangents all the time trying to explain Simon. And we were very much didn't want to do that. We always wanted it to be from the point of view of the women. And we're only learning about Simon, what they learn about Simon, at the same time as they learn it, really. So that was the very clear vision from the start. It was always really important to us that this was the woman's story.
Mm. We knew, didn't we, that the audience had to experience the story through the women's eyes. You mentioned, Ross, that, how did we decide not to tell a dozen victim stories? Because there are many, many more than just Cecilia, Pernilla and Eileen. But as with sort of, unfairly with these kinds of crimes, I think people sort of hear about a dating scam and translate that into it's a, desperate, pathetic woman. So we knew from the outset that we needed to get the sympathy of the viewer, for them to sort of fully understand and immerse them in one woman's experience of this guy and of this con, essentially. So that's why we sort of chose, as Barney said, just to sort of stick with Cecilia at the beginning, and then obviously her kind of going to the press, exposing what happened to her and what happened to Simon, who Simon was, then, allow for this sort of baton to then be passed to Pernilla to come into the story, which then, allows for then the story to kind of go viral, and then obviously for Eileen to pick it up, and then the baton is passed again. So that's sort of what we loved about the three women who we feature in the film.
Because I thought it was a brave choice. And I suppose it's something you could look at in the making of it, whether or not you felt that was going to work, to have Cecilia carry it for quite a long time. But then she is so engaging and charismatic that she does that. So, and I remember in Don't Fuck With Cats, which I know you produced, that there was quite a limited number of interviewees, but it really focused the story. And I think sometimes it can be a filmmaker's kind of initial thought of let's get as many voices here as we can, and then we can really figure out who tells what part of the story best. But in doing it in this way, it's really focused. It's a particular person, or in this case, three people's story along with the reporters. So I thought that was a really brave choice. Was that something you wavered on? Was that something that was questioned along the way, or that was it from the start?
I think we'd met Cecilia and Pernilla. We'd spent hours and hours and hours speaking to them on Zoom. Bernie did these incredible research calls with them, which allowed me to essentially script out the film. And so we knew that, that they were captivating, they would be captivating interviewees, and that, we worked really hard to build up, a level of trust with them, so that when we came to interview them, we could sit with them, and that they would, really open up. And I can never say it enough, just how easy it is, I think, for directors and producers to sit the other side of the camera, to have the camera just by your shoulder here, a second camera that, to the side, all of the crew behind you, and then be asking the questions and expect interviewees to just sort of tell us your life story and the thing that's, the worst thing that's ever happened to you. And I think that was what was particularly incredible about Cecilia, was that she, just allowed sort of all of that to fade into the background and just totally wears her heart on her sleeve. And I think that that is what makes her so captivating and charismatic, is that she is able to do that. And, you know, we sort of can't thank her enough really for trusting us enough to really just, you know, let all of your barriers and boundaries down and tell the story as it happened. You know, the other thing is that they all, as I said, they really dislike, they hate Simon. And so for Cecilia, she then had to put herself back in the love story, in sort of, you know, regurgitating all of those feelings that she's probably, you know, pushed away, to make us understand what he was like as a lover and as a partner and as a boyfriend.
Yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned that. It's kind of almost like a house style of some of Raw's films, is that very much in the moment storytelling. And it's kind of like, you know, I call it like the past continuous. You know, you're asking people, you know, tell me just about that part of the story. You know, is that something? I'd be really interested. I hate these kind of questions, like how long were the interviews? How much footage did you film? But I'm really curious about, if we just take Cecilia's interview, you know, it's in a particular place. It feels like it's at a particular time, but it must have been reasonably long for you to be able to go through in detail everything and then presumably only use a small portion of that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a 2-day interview in a very cold restaurant in December. So she was a real trooper. But yeah, I mean, it is, like, you know, like Fliss says, we always have to kind of remember just how much these people are giving to us when they go in front of the camera. You know, it's emotionally exhausting. You know, we think we're working really hard by making sure we ask all the right questions and get all the right answers. In the meantime, they're having to repeat answers all the time. They're having to really cast their mind back. They're having to try it another way. So they really do give everything. And it is a testament to how much kind of the relationship that we have with them and the trust that they have. But, you know, like Fliss said, it was kind of, we need to feel the romance of this part. And obviously it's really hard because, you know, these girls have been traumatized by what happened to them. So for them to remember, I remember when we were trying to get her to talk about the first kiss, when the first kiss that they have in the elevator, and she really, bless her, she really struggled to take herself back. And she's like, I hit him. And you have to just try and remember that you didn't always kiss him. At this point, you were really excited and you were really looking forward to that first kiss. And she was kind of, you know, she got it, as it turned out, actually, we got that from her on the second day after she was a bit warmed up. Sometimes it works actually to start further along the timeline, then work their way back when they're a bit more warmed up. But it was also just helping her understand why we're doing it and kind of constantly reiterating, don't worry, you're going to get to be angry later. You really are. We're going to let you express the anger later. But right now, in this moment, we need to feel like you are just heart eyes besotted with this guy and just obsessed with him and can't wait to hear from him. And actually, she was amazing at doing that. After, you know, with the right coaching, with the right time, she got it. And she was really able to just get into the zone and really remember that. So it was a stunning interview to watch kind of unfold. But it's emotionally exhausting for the contributors to go through this. And once it gets whittled down to then those final, you know, however many minutes of Cecilia are actually in the final countdown, you know, because we have to make sure that we get everything. We have to get every single bit of the story so that we always have it in the edit. But there was always key turning points that we knew we specifically needed to get. And a lot of those were driven by the digital archive as well. And actually what really helped the girls was that a lot of the story could be told by the WhatsApps. So, you know, one WhatsApp could actually tell us as much as 3 minutes of stink in the chair could. So that was really helpful as well.
It's interesting that the conversation you can have with a contributor during an interview saying, well, this is why we're asking this in this way. And this might be why we have to ask you to do it again. I think that sometimes taking away that kind of veneer between you and explaining what you're doing as you're doing it can actually build trust, because they start to understand why you're looking for certain things. It's kind of, I think it's worth kind of being as open as that.
Well, the thing is as well, Pernilla and Cecilia had by this stage done a lot of just kind of classic news interviews. So they were used to telling the story, but in a very kind of succinct, abridged way. And they were used to telling the story, but they weren't used to storytelling.
Yeah.
So it was kind of making that distinction. Like, no, we don't just need the facts. We need you to take us on the journey. But once they got the hang of it, they were away.
It's interesting that, Bernie, you did the kind of setup interviews, and then Felicity, you do the on the day interview, because I sometimes wonder about that, if the director does too much with the people in advance, that it can kind of take away from the moment. Is that part of the reason why you do it that way?
I don't know, because I don't know that it would have really. I think with the women in the film, it was important for both of us to have, they're our peers at the end of the day. So, I think that there's a sort of maybe a slightly older fashioned way of filmmaking, which is, the director is, the all important person who sort of comes in on shoot day and sits down and, interviews the contributor. But for us, we built up a friendship, with all of the women. And I think it was, it was more sort of like workload sharing, but, Bernie, did just like a wonderful job of these, sort of 10-hour Zooms with each of the women, which then essentially, that's basically a sort of a full script then, which I worked into a script, and then with sort of all of the WhatsApps as well, which, we had transcribed every single voice note, sort of 800 pages of these things, then working them into the script. So that actually, by the time we got to the edit, I mean, obviously the final film has sort of come on those and you do tons of work in the edit, but, that script that we had that we were working from is sort of the final film in a way, I think. But yeah, so we just sort of had to, we had a really generous pre-production period that meant that once we went into filming, I mean, we only shot for 14 days. That's all of the drama, all of the interviews. We sort of knew what we needed.
Wow, that's amazing. And so can you tell me a bit more about that scripting process then? What's your, I suppose, approach to that? To, is there any technique to taking all that material and kind of making it into a 2-hour script?
My advice would be make sure that your script is more like 2 hours and not 10 hours, which mine was. But I think that, the best thing about that is that you can map out where the turning points are, which, are difficult to then, if you haven't got, because there's no narration in these films. So if you haven't got the contributor saying it, it's very difficult to create that in the edit. And so I think that was really helpful for us. And then also sort of, the overlapping of the women's stories. It also just prompts us, on things that they've said in their interviews that are absolute gold dust, like, incredible lines, one-liners that you then think, oh gosh, they were, I wish they'd said that on the interview day, but actually then you've got a note of it and you can say, look, in your pre-interview you said this, can you just tell me that again? And it's just like a great sort of, you just got your a map, a roadmap really to guide you through, and you can sort of cross off the bits of the story that you've done and bits of the story that you feel that you've covered well enough. And, Bernie would sit next to me and be sort of, we'd sort of share the burden, I think, of making sure that sort of every little bit of the story that we wanted to get, that we got, and that we got it, well enough.
Well, it's when you have those people for a couple of days and maybe not again, then I suppose it makes a lot of sense just to get it all, and especially if you only have 14 days. So what was the approach to that from a production point of view? Did you have a gap after the interviews to kind of think about how to approach the additional footage?
Yeah, we had a long gap between assembling the film, doing all of the interviews, assembling the film. We were also sort of blighted by COVID. So a couple of the interviews we had to do remotely, and, we were kind of waiting, hoping that, places would open up so that we could travel. But in the end, it was just, let's just get it done, because otherwise, we'll never finish the film. And then, we had put together, I guess, a radio play of all of the interviews. And then you kind of tighten it. We had all of the graphics that we created for the WhatsApps. And then black holes to fill. We knew that we wanted to do fairly, not too on the nose recon, very much through the eyes of the women experiencing the glamour and the dates and the restaurants. We knew that was something that we would want to recreate. And then so we had a sort of long old drama shoot off the back of the World Cup final that started at 2 a.m. In a hotel in London, to sort of do all of the drama scenes that you see. And we did a little bit of recon drama filming in Amsterdam as well.
And Stockholm.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you had potentially a very long film that eventually ended up being an hour and 50 odd minutes. But a lot of the time now with docs, is kind of a question: is this a series or is it a feature? At any point, did you think that maybe this was a series?
We didn't know. We always wanted it to be a feature doc. We always just felt, because we wanted it to be propulsive the whole way through. We didn't want to feel like we were kind of just like stretching something out to try and get a cliffhanger, which then would lead into episode 2. And the thing about Simon during this period was that he was doing the same thing again and again and again with different people. So it would have just been the same story with different women. And we had the women who could really actually take the story from A to B to C in that kind of relay race that Fliss was mentioning earlier. And we just knew that we could make this a really exciting romance turned mystery turned thriller if we just kept it tight and kept it to the 2 hours. If we tried to stretch it into a series, we probably would have had to delve more into Simon and his background and all of that. And we really, as we said earlier, we really didn't want this to be about Simon. So we just thought we've got everything that we need to illustrate how this guy works can be done by using these 3 women in a 2-hour thriller doc. Mm-hmm. So we fought quite hard for that. We always felt very strongly that that's what we wanted it to be.
Yeah, so you say you fought for it. So it was obviously something that was discussed at some point. A little bit. Okay, we'll move on.
I mean, you're always thinking, is there more? Yeah. Is there more in this? You also want the women to feel like they've had their, like that they've told their story in as full a way as possible. And, there's no denying that Cecilia's story, Penilla's story, Eileen's story could easily fill an episode each. But, what we have felt from the start is that this is a story that feels like a movie. It has all the trappings of like, you couldn't write a script like this, really. And so I think we went into this feeling we want to make a feature doc that feels like a movie, whether or not we've achieved that. But yeah, that was the ambition. A really tight feature doc that you can watch in one night, and that almost leaves you wanting more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's exactly that. It's just so incredible. It's amazing. And it's amazing that you came across it and everything. And I mean, a couple other questions. It's interesting, just a few choices as a director. Felicity, this was your first film being the director. How did that change, I suppose, how you approach the whole process? Were you starting to get asked questions you weren't used to be asking? What kind of things did you want? I mean, I know the interviews are all feel like they're in a date scenario, which I thought was really, really good. What kind of things were you thinking as a director going into it?
The idea of situating the interviews as dates was Bernie's idea, so I can't take any credit for that. Which was, perfect, the perfect place for them to be. We wanted it to feel sort of, I knew that I wanted the interviews to feel intimate and for you to get a sense that there were, women making this film. I knew that I wanted the women to, look and feel really amazing when they watched it. So, we and have sort of, obviously, we've got the kind of, the gorgeous romantic lighting and so on. And, we use these very cool 70s lenses, anamorphic lenses, and so on. And I actually haven't worked with the DOP, Edgar Dubrovsky, before. I'd sort of been following him on Instagram and really liked the look of the things that he'd made in the past. And then we started talking about the look and feel of the film and how, we wanted the romance to feel warm and inviting, but then for the film to sort of get bleaker and colder as it goes on, which is why Eileen's interview is then sort of in the day. It's like reality has hit home. The, bubble has burst. It's the morning after the horrific night before kind of thing. And that's why her interview is daytime, and the other two women who are obviously, still in the love story are much warmer and romantic. And then, then you've got the three, there's the cool kind of Norwegian, Scandinavian element to it, that sort of noir vibe that we talked a lot about, didn't we, Bernie, and their interviews. Well, we didn't actually get to go over to Norway to film them, unfortunately, but we had an amazing remote crew out there who sort of set up those interviews for us while we were in London in the office on Zoom. And they're sort of much bluer and cooler. But, the music for me was a huge part of the film as well. I'm not sure what you thought, Ross, but we wanted it to, we had this incredible young female composer called Jessica Jones. And when we went to her, we said, well, it's a film that starts as a romance, that then goes into a mystery, that then turns really dark and is a horror. And then you've sort of got this unsettling feeling at the end of it. And, we talked a lot about how we wanted the music to feel at the start, and took cues from, big sort of rom-com, Bridgerton, all of those series and movies. And so I think, and we wanted Simon to have a theme that kind of morphed and got darker throughout. So if you listen in, you'll hear that. And then also for the women to have their own theme as well, that then sort of keeps coming up. And I think that for me personally, that is a really amazing part of the film is the music.
The music is stunning. So she did an amazing job. But how was that process then? Because obviously, I guess the film is essentially a year in the making if you were interviewing back in last winter. So she must not have had all that long. Was she working with a finished film, or did she start giving you cues as you went along?
Yeah, once we got into the edit, she started giving us cues. And, we work with temporary tracks that we sort of lay down just so that Julian Hart, the editor, cuts to the music. And then she sort of takes that, but then totally transforms it and makes it her own. So we were speaking to her all the time, weren't we? But, that final track, that end track, we went, round in circles about, where the cards, the sort of final cards are over. And, we had a pop track in there, we had another track in there. And then in the end, we thought, no, this needs to be a composed, uncomfortable feeling piece of music. And she did that in a day, so amazing. She was amazing to work with. It was an incredible experience for both of us, because I think as producers, that's not, we both produced before, that's not part of the filmmaking that you're as involved in as much. And we both, loved it.
Yeah, it's a brilliant part of the process when you start getting those tracks and they're working, and there's, even a surprise to you and how that person has brought something of their own. I suppose it's the same with the editor to a degree as well. And you went in with your script. Julian's obviously a renowned documentary editor. How was that relationship and working to get it from your much longer version down to the 2 hours?
Julian is talented beyond. He's an incredible storyteller. He also, for this, he's a bit of a softie, which he was brilliant in that he wanted to kind of he got wrapped up in the love story as much as we did. He's just a master, really, the way that he can kind of make those turns really work and build. The graphics, I can't tell you, was just a huge mammoth bit of work. And then all of obviously the montages that he cut together and how quickly that, I think there's more montages in this film than he's ever done before. There's more cuts in this film than he's ever done before. So, but yeah, it was fantastic having him. The film wouldn't be what it is now without obviously Julian getting his hands on it and getting stuck into it with us.
Yeah, just as a final question, so you have two very well-known exec producers in Bart Layton and Sam Starbuck as well. I mean, it sounds like you guys didn't need much help and you were all over it, but did it help to work? Did it help to work with with that kind of guidance available to you, I suppose?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Bart is a master. Well, they both are, but Bart obviously did The Imposter. So they both brought very different elements to it, but where they were both brilliant was, it's very hard not to get really married to a story, especially when you've been researching it for as long as we had, and say, this is a really important part, or this is a really important part, and then they would kind of look at the cut and they'd be like, actually, I don't think you need that, or I don't think you need this. And we'd be like, no, that's really important. They'd be like, no, seriously, trust us, just get rid of it. And it's when they can come in with that kind of vision at the top and just watch it without being so involved in it, that they really make it that kind of propulsive thrill. Like one of Bart's favorite expressions to use in the edit, let's get off to the races. Why is this taking so long? Start the story. So all of those kind of notes coming back from both of them were like super helpful, and also just being really supportive throughout the process. As Fliss has mentioned, we were making this during 2020 and 2021, so that came with obviously a huge amount of challenges, and just to have their support, and Sam particularly was always fighting for us to make sure that we got what we wanted, to make sure that the production team were doing everything that they could to make sure that we were able to travel, that we had everything that we could possibly need. So, I mean, the whole wider team on this film were just exceptional. We were so lucky with them. We've already said that the next time we want to make a film, we want to do it with this exact team. We're totally spoiled now. But yeah, I mean, having execs with that level of experience, we understand that we're very lucky, and that it was a huge benefit to us to have them overseeing it and guiding us.
Well, listen, guys, congratulations on a brilliant film. I'm sure it's going to be a ginormous success. So thanks for talking to me, and best of luck with it.
Thanks so much.
Thanks again to Felicity Morris and Bernie Higgins for taking part in the interview. The Tinder Swindler is now available on Netflix worldwide. Thanks to Stephen Galvin and Film Ireland for supporting the podcast, and to film composer Michael Fleming for kindly allowing me to steal his music. You can find more of it at michaelflemingmusic.com. And thanks to you for listening.